Hello everyone, I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business here on the University of Denver campus. And I have a question for you. How do companies and their marketing departments get themselves into positions where they consciously make some extraordinarily inappropriate decisions, such as knowingly selling flawed, potentially life-endangering products, or secondly, marketing life-saving pharmaceuticals at bankruptcy-causing prices, or thirdly, inadequately protecting consumer data from data hackers? Well, you probably recognize these stories as stories that have been reported in both the public and the business press over the past couple of months. Seldom, however, do we have the opportunity to hear some real marketing professionals debate the ethics and the efficacy of such decisions. Well, that's what we're going to do here this morning. We have invited 4 outstanding business and academic pros to examine these decisions and offer their assessments of the ethics of the strategies and policies that bring those decisions about. Let's meet our panel. Our first panelist is Professor Dan Back. Dan Back is an associate professor in the marketing department at the Daniels College of Business and is a principal in the Brand Cartography Group, a strategic advisory firm. Our second panelist is Ms. Heather Kennedy. Heather is a lecturer in the marketing department at the Daniels College of Business and a consultant to the Whole Foods market. Our third panelist is Mr. Ross Bagali. Ross is an adjunct professor in the marketing department at the Daniels College of Business and serves on the marketing department's advisory board. Ross also served as CEO of U.S. West Enterprises and held several sales and general management positions with the Computer Sciences Corporation. Professor Stephen Hartley is the moderator for our panel. Steve is a professor of marketing at the Daniels College of Business and has served as chair of that department twice over his 30-year career. Professor Hartley is also co-author of 2 of the leading textbooks in marketing.
Thank you, panelists, for being with us today on our ethics panel. I'd like to start with a question about products that manufacturers introduce to the marketplace, and in particular products that have flaws in them. We've learned recently that General Motors has recalled more than 20 million of their vehicles, and the press has given substantial amount of attention to the issue of the knowledge and awareness that they had of the faulty ignition switch and the deaths related to the faulty ignition switch. Heather, could you give us your insights on the ethical responsibilities of manufacturers related to the products, particularly when there are flaws in the products?
Sure. Well, I think we can all agree that a company has a responsibility and an ethical responsibility to provide the safest product that they can. With that said, I don't think we can hold companies to 100% standard that they're always going to have the most perfect product out there. Mistakes happen, things happen, errors happen, especially with something as complicated as a car. The ethical issue that came to light in the GM case, and why the GM case was particularly disturbing, is the way that they handled that information once they had it. That they were not very transparent with it, that they didn't go through a major recall as they probably should have. They knew as early as 2001 that something was wrong with this ignition switch, that people's knees were hitting the ignition switch while they were driving, and it would shut down the car completely, locking it up and causing accidents that kill people. I think up to now they've at least established that 26 people have been for sure killed through an accident that was caused by this malfunction. In 2004, they started to receive complaints about this product. So why is it that it was almost 10 years later that they started recalling these products? So that sort of hiding of information, not being super transparent about what was happening and actually taking action is a real violation of trust, not just for the customers, but also to their shareholders. They did a cost-benefit analysis and said it would cost 90 cents per car plus $400,000 in manufacturing costs to do a recall and replace these items in 2005. So instead, they've now spent $1.3 billion recalling these products. That doesn't even include the legal costs that they're going through, nor the damage to their brand. So it's been a much greater ethical violation, again, not only to the customers, but to their shareholders. And I do think that we tend to value companies on such a short-term basis that we almost encourage the executive teams and CEOs of companies to make these ethical decisions quarter by quarter. A CEO has 2 bad quarters in a row and they talk about ousting him. So how is he going to make a decision where he takes an expensive hit in the short term that's going to benefit the company in the long term?
Heather, I've got a follow-up on that one. Actually, I have 2. The first one is, we just had this example about exploding airbags. And the exploding airbag situation, of course, is basically turning the inside of a vehicle into a shrapnel zone, as if a grenade had gone off. We find out now that Takata employees in the United States knew about this years ago and opted to keep it quiet and not discuss it at all. So that would be my first question that I had for you. And the second one comes back to short-term financial reporting is hardly a justification in my mind for killing your customers. So, I think we need more discussion around that too, don't we?
Absolutely. Well, I do think in the airbag case, if you can go back and prove that there are individuals that consistently made decisions to put a knowingly faulty product into a vehicle that kills somebody or potentially could, damage or kill somebody, that we should consider taking criminal action on them. Why should they be held to a different standard than we hold the rest of society? If you get into a car and you're inebriated, you will face consequences if you kill somebody. So I think that knowledge, and if you can prove that knowledge, is justification for seeking criminal indictment on some of these folks.
Good.
I agree with you that judging people on a quarterly basis is not a reason or a rationale for making an unethical decision. However, I think it's reality. I've worked in 2 very different companies, one that's very quarterly focused and one that was very long-term vision focused. And I think the pressures of Wall Street can make people make unethical decisions or can encourage people. It creates an environment where unethical decisions are taken as being okay because they are thinking about increasing shareholder value above everything else.
I understand, but that is never an acceptable excuse. So, absolutely, public companies in the United States report quarterly. Some parts of the world, they report semi-annually. But regardless, that can never be an acceptable answer for someone consciously making a decision that endangers people's lives.
I agree 100%. And I think we actually have a responsibility, and I would love to see that change from Wall Street, where they are looking more long-term and they are encouraging companies to take a more long-term approach to their business, not just from an ethical perspective, but from the health of the business in general. Working at Whole Foods, which has a very long-term vision, a very long-term focus. When the stock price goes down, we don't really change our plan. We keep that vision on the customer. What is best for the customer? And I feel like in the case of GM, if they had focused on the customer and making sure that they're doing what's right for their customer, they wouldn't have even worried about that initial investment. It wouldn't have even occurred to them that that was a choice that they could make. And so I think that's what's really disappointing is, there's a lot of great examples of companies that keep their customer first and make their business decisions based on the customer, and they see financial success because of that. It's not just about the increasing shareholder value.
You're right.
And I think there's a distinction between a reason and an excuse. So the wrong perspective may be one of the reasons why this unfortunate issue happened, but that's not in any way excusing the behavior.
Absolutely.
And I also think it's important to point out that there are thousands of companies that face these pressures, and most of them aren't doing things that result in the death of their consumers. So it's not just the short-term quarterly focus. I think there were broader structural and institutional issues within GM. And that leads to a follow-up question that I have, Heather. So GM in the early 2000s spun off their big manufacturing arm, Delphi, and there were a lot of issues around that spin-off and around outsourcing. And Delphi felt like they had a really contentious relationship with GM, that there were cultural problems, monopolistic problems, and of course Delphi is the manufacturer that made the ignition switch. And Delphi says they have no responsibility, no culpability, that it was GM who was screening, auditing, et cetera. But what is the role of supply chain management and outsourcing and this continual quest for greater efficiency in that context? What's the role of that in this problem?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, especially with the product as complicated as a car, where there's so many components that go into that product, and you're outsourcing probably a great majority of those, I would think. And so I think that the companies that create the components obviously have a responsibility to provide the safest product possible, but ultimately it's up to GM, who's putting that final product out there, to have an auditing system in place where they're looking at every component, that they're testing the cars. You know, the ignition issue came up during a test where a test driver hit it with his knee and the car locked up. So they have those processes in place, and they should have those processes in place. I don't think that this finger pointing that's happening with Delphi is really helping the situation at all. It has to do with the safety of the customer, and so yes, Delphi is responsible, but ultimately GM is responsible for the product that they put out on the market.
Agreed.
Heather, we have a question from the audience related to the responsibility of automakers and their suppliers to change the culture in their organization from what appears to be a culture of hide flaws in their products. Do you think this is an ethical responsibility for these companies? Is it possible to make the change?
Is it an ethical responsibility? I mean, I think it's where every company needs to go now, because we live in a transparent society now. Everything is available, information's available. We all know what happened with GM now. It may have taken years for it to come out, but it was going to come out eventually, whether it's tracked through emails or through conversation. There's all kinds of ways that we can get information now. So transparency is there. And I think if a lot of companies have this sort of keep everything close to the chest, and I don't think that they can do that anymore. And it's hard to change an internal culture, but I think starting with being transparent internally will help people feel that they have an environment where they can bring things up, where they can say, hey, this isn't right, and sort of create a culture of empowerment where people feel like they can call something out or be a whistleblower if they need to be. I think it's realistically, I think it's incredibly difficult. It comes from the top. But again, I think there's companies that show that they can be successful and be transparent. Whole Foods is one, Zappos is another. They have these cultures of incredible transparency and empowerment that, again, maybe we're not worried about killing people when we're selling shoes, but the food industry, you know, there's things that happen in the food industry all the time, that recalls and people getting sick from products. So making sure that you're being as transparent as you can internally will help people be a little bit more transparent externally.
You know, I think back to comparing this to the Toyota sticky brakes issue. You know, the CEO of Toyota America was very transparent. He's a DU alum, and he was very transparent, went before Congress, took blame, apologized. You contrast that with GM, who's fighting a bunch of different claims around, you threw out the 26 number, but I've seen sources say 115 people or so have died because of the ignition switch, and they're still not being. If you can't be publicly transparent in a case of crisis like this, it's very hard to see how you're going to have organizational change.
Exactly.
You know, and if we just take that, you know, one iteration further, you know, transparency is important. It's good for a lot of business reasons. But, you know, beyond transparency, ethics is doing the right thing when nobody's watching, right? So the fact that you're visible and you may not be able to get away with hiding it doesn't make hiding it a viable alternative. The right thing is what leadership's about. And so you go right to the leadership at Whole Foods or Zappos, where you don't have these kinds of issues, and you go to the leadership at GM, where it's a way of life. That's where the ethics issue really resides, I think.
I agree with you, Ross, and I think that it is really difficult to have, or you really want to have those leaders that have that long-term vision and that are able to be really strong and ethical and not always think about making money and making sure that their company is making money, that they're actually making it by being ethical and by putting the right culture in place within their organization.
Exactly.
Let's turn our attention now to another topic, which is cybersecurity. And we've learned recently about several large organizations who have, through security breaches, had the personal information of millions of their customers stolen. We've learned about Home Depot and Target recently, for example. And Dan, I wonder if you could share with us your insights about the ethical responsibilities of companies to protect the personal information of their customers.
Thanks, Steve. It's an important question, and these numbers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So Target, for example, initially said was around 40 million consumers, then it was 70, then it was 110 million. Adobe has said 130 million people lost information through Adobe. You had Apple have celebrity photos hacked and posted online. So this is an increasing problem around cybersecurity, and it's an important ethical question, particularly around the level of responsibility companies have to maintain privacy of consumer data. If you look into the issues with Home Depot or Target or Adobe, you'll see that in many of those cases, the companies were doing best practices. It wasn't like in the case of the GM ignition switch issue that was in the news, where there was a key point where an employee made a bad decision. It's more a case that technology is changing so quickly, and so many of us are now using credit cards, we're doing online shopping. It's easier to hack this information and get access to hundreds of millions of people's information. So I do think companies should be held to a higher standard around privacy for this specific information, but I also think it's going to be a continual problem moving forward.
Thank you.
Dan, I've got something around this one bothers me, and I'm certainly not inclined to give companies a break when I think they're responsible for an issue. But in this case, consumers are knowingly choosing to use mobile shopping, to use online shopping, obviously credit cards, and they're doing it with a conscious choice that they are getting much greater, much better access to more products, to more personalized solutions, and they're getting a lot of convenience. In exchange for that, they are knowingly putting their privacy and security at risk. So I think when you have a situation where consumers are knowingly opting to do something that puts them at risk, you have to give the corporations a little bit of slack.
That's a great point, Ross. And I think there are a couple different points that I would have around that issue. I think first, you're right. Consumers get a lot of benefit from being able to shop online, being able to shop, do mobile shopping. I know when Christmas gets close, I'll be watching the Amazon.com shipping time and make sure I get all my gifts in right before so they get there in time. So certainly everybody is doing more online shopping and getting a lot of benefit from that. But I think consumers can't weigh the risk effectively. These numbers are large numbers. They're hard for individuals to process. They don't know what risks they're really taking on. You see a news story that 40 million accounts got hacked at Target, and you really don't know what the implications are. You might even not know if you have a Target card or not. So I think consumers can't assess the risk, and also they can't maintain their privacy. So they don't have the resources to stop a hacker. They don't have the resources to really take responsibility and protect themselves other than just not engaging in the process.
Okay.
And I was also wondering, I read, at least in the Target case, that there was some knowledge up front, that they knew that there was some breach in the system, that there were people kind of throwing up red flags here and there as they were updating their system, and that they chose not to invest in that upgrade. And so to your point, technology is changing so fast all the time. What is the responsibility of companies to make that investment? Because it can be a significant financial investment to continue to upgrade.
I think companies need to make a good faith effort to protect data and to protect privacy, but consumers need to be aware that the largest companies in the world can make the best investments and their data still may be vulnerable.
Yeah.
A question from the audience, Dan. Is there a difference in the ethical responsibility from organizations for the information that they collect and obtain for their customers that might result in a hack that attempts to use all that information versus targeted security breaches that's looking for information about particular people, specifically celebrities?
That's a great question, Steve, and I think there is a clear difference between the two. The first case is really leveraging this big data movement that's an emerging field within business and marketing, where you have these huge databases with hundreds and millions of data points. And what you have is you have sometimes as small as a group of 10 people getting access to 40 million people's information, 56 million people's information, and then hoping to make money off of fraudulent activity around that information that they get, credit card numbers, things like that. That's very different from the celebrity hacking, where you had around 400 celebrity accounts that were targeted really with the goal of getting private information that could be posted online, frankly nude pictures that could be posted online, and then you can sell those pictures, and then you can make money off of people going into those websites to view those pictures. So it's a very different process. And in the second case, it leads to different ethical considerations. You start to talk about who owns those pictures, who has the right to post that information. If Scarlett Johansson doesn't want pictures of her posted online, does she have the right to go to Google, to go to BuzzFeed, to go to various places and say, I don't want these pictures out there? And it's interesting because this behavior, this targeting and these posting of pictures people don't want out, happens to non-celebrities all the time. Bad breakups, things like that, you'll have these pictures posted, but it only really started to draw attention when it was, you know, the Black Widow from the Avengers movie that's having her pictures posted. But there's a real question, who gets to decide what's online? Who makes that choice?
Thank you.
I'm sorry, but this kind of drives to the crux of the issue around cloud computing. As you know, I come out of the IT industry, and for years, everybody recognized the tremendous advantages and opportunities associated with the cloud. And conversely, everybody always knew that the big issues were security and privacy, and that there is just no good, reliable way yet to protect that. So whether it's Scarlett Johansson or Heather, I mean, if somebody chooses to put their information in the cloud, they know it's vulnerable. And should Apple have been more careful with that? Of course. Should Apple's cloud be more secure than it is? Absolutely. But does that mean that the individual, whether it's J-Law or Scarlett or Heather, doesn't have a responsibility to be careful with their own proprietary information?
I agree with you, and I think if what is more damaging that's out there, I like Jennifer Lawrence as much as the next person, but I'm not as worried about her naked picture out there in the world and than I am about hundreds of thousands of people's private information being stolen and potentially their identities being stolen. And so if I was going to say to Apple, which should you prioritize? Yes, Jennifer Lawrence got a lot more press, but it's really the people who are going to pay for that breach that I think should be prioritized from a security perspective.
I also think we're moving to a new normal around privacy and online activity. I think the unfortunate reality, and I'm a parent of 3 kids, that some of their worst moments are going to be online now. So I think we need to move culturally to where we accept that everybody's not perfect, and there may be a picture of you, Ross, online from college doing a keg stand or whatever it might be, that is going to be out there. And so this is the new normal, and I know when I talk with my students about it, they often view it as more of a boomer issue than they do a millennial issue. They know there's a lot more information about them online. They know that they don't have the same expectations of privacy that maybe their grandparents did. But in return for that, they get to post pictures on Instagram, they get to text back and forth, they get all these benefits.
I think that's right, and that's kind of the issue I was addressing earlier, that consumers are consciously making these decisions because there are a lot of benefits that accrue to you. I'm a good example. I mean, my new phone backs everything up immediately in Google without my knowledge or action. I click photos around the house, and I don't even know that I did until I turn around the next day and my Google account pops up that there's new photos to see. Fortunately, they weren't like J-Law's. But Then again, I don't look like J-Lo either.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. Let's turn our attention now to another topic, generally pricing of products and more specifically, the pricing of life-saving drugs. We've learned recently from several large pharmaceutical companies that the drugs they offer that can have a direct impact on the lives of their patients and customers can cost as much as $10,000 per month. Ross, could you comment on the ethical responsibility of the pharmaceutical companies in pricing these products?
Sure, and this is really one that it's easy for me to get passionate about. The reality is, you know, you don't have to market a pharmaceutical drug. When you have somebody who is going to die, you have a gun to their head. They're going to have to pay whatever you charge. So it's not a marketing question, it's 100% an ethical issue. And by the way, your example of $10,000 a month is conservative. We actually have some drugs that are costing $300,000 a year for a standard treatment. Now, the consumer price index over the last 5 years has increased approximately 12%. The cost of a lot of these high-end pharmaceuticals in the same period have increased 160%. So we're way beyond any kind of financial justification for the prices that the pharmaceutical companies are charging.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. I mean, if you watch the 60 Minutes segment, it's really hard to watch that segment and not come to the conclusion that Big Pharma is evil and doing all these terrible things. But if you start to think about the positive social benefit that comes out of these pharmaceutical innovations, and you think about the research and development costs, you think about all the time and effort and money spent to create that drug that is worth $100,000, $300,000, and the benefits that come from it. And you especially start to consider, as boomers age, as our country gets older, there's a lot more demand for these drugs. And so there's a lot more money going into research and development specifically for cancer drugs, specifically for some of these drugs that are life savings. What is the responsibility? Why is Big Pharma responsible for cutting down their profit margins when other companies aren't asked to do the same?
Well, I mean, that's a fair question. And of course, we know that it's the cost of development and the cost of R&D that is the big factor and the big justification for pharmaceutical expenses. However, that's not the reality. The reality is, and you can easily put a pen and paper to this, when a pharmaceutical company develops a new drug and they're going to put it under patent, they've got a life cycle for that drug. What we're seeing is that while drugs approach their expiration, the pharmaceutical companies are actually raising the prices. So the same drug that they've already recovered the R&D cost over 10 years ago, they are continuing to increase the cost and the charge to the consumer. It's really the mentality of milking a product toward the end of its life cycle, because when they lose the patent protection, it's going to go generic. You could also easily take an analysis that says, you know, you have to spend $1 billion to produce a drug. You have to produce 5 drugs to get one successful one. So you can take a $5 billion cost, allocate that across that one successful drug. You don't have to make $1,000 per pill. And so it would be easy for the pharmaceutical companies to justify and explain a rational recovery of their expenses. That's not what they're doing. They're basically extorting money from the people who are most vulnerable.
Can I follow up on that briefly?
Sure.
So in my mind, consumers are behaving rationally. If your goal is to not pass away, you have a lifetime of earnings ahead of you, you'd pay $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. That's a rational economic decision. And in my mind, the corporations are making as much money as they can. They're being rational. What's the role of the government in this process? Shouldn't there be an outside actor that jumps in? It seems like it's inappropriate to expect a business to just decide to curtail extra profit, and there should be an outside person that's involved in this instead.
Well, that's a fair comment, but that leads to, of course, what would become a regulated industry. That's the way public utilities work. You know, they earn a rate of return. rate of return based on their equity base. If you go to the typical public utility, like the old telephone company a few years back, they had an equity base. That equity base allowed them to earn about 6% on that equity. If they increased their equity because they were putting in more facilities, new fiber, new capabilities, then they would be able to earn 6% on that greater amount of money. But the pharmaceutical industry is only regulated from a health perspective, from a safety perspective. It's not regulated from a rate of return perspective. So what we end up with is it's not a rational decision, because whether somebody is 20 and they have another 40 years or 50 years to earn income, or if they're 75, their life is still worth whatever the pharmaceutical company demands from them to keep themselves alive.
I have a question around advertising.
Sure.
So direct-to-consumer advertising in the pharmaceutical industry is only allowed or only legal in 2 countries. That's the United States and New Zealand. How do you feel that investment, first of all, in advertising affects pricing, and does it? And then there's sort of another ethical question around creating demand where there might not be any, that you're encouraging consumers to believe that there's something wrong with them, that they might need this product, and then they go to their doctor and ask for it. Is that an ethical dilemma as well?
Well, I think those are really 2 good points. Obviously, there's 2 countries you've identified that allow advertising to consumers for pharmaceuticals. And I believe only one of those 2 countries doesn't have socialized medicine. So the reality is it's only the United States where you have the consumer responsible for his health care and for paying for his pharmaceuticals, and you advertise to him. Clearly, if nothing else, you could make a case that if the pharmaceutical company didn't advertise, the cost of their campaign should come directly out of the selling price of the drugs, because there's no need for that. Consumers don't make a rational choice about buying drugs, especially when you're talking about the serious life-threatening illnesses where the drugs are so expensive. Those options are really driven by their medical provider, typically their doctor or their healthcare organization. So there's no justification that I can see to advertise to consumers. And to your point, I don't know that it creates unneeded or unrequired demand, but what it probably does is create more questions for the medical provider, who has to then explain why he or she doesn't think that drug is appropriate.
I do think it's important to note that a majority of the advertisements that Heather's talking about are not for these life-saving $10,000 a month cancer drugs. They're for Viagra and Cialis, and I watch a lot of ESPN, so that's all I see are those sort of ads. So they're for drugs that are optional, not drugs that are life or death.
And that's fair, and that's a legitimate point. And drugs of that nature, obviously, it is a consumer choice about buying them or not buying them.
But I do think there's some ethical dilemma around someone ingesting something that potentially has side effects. I mean, there is something around, I know they do all the little crazy, small, fine print in the advertising, but they're basically encouraging someone to take a drug that could potentially have side effects, or ingest something that they potentially don't need.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a red herring on an offering prospectus. When a stock goes public and you put out the offering, the official red herring is all the disclaimers that are required by law. Mm-hmm. If anybody ever read that, they would never buy a stock, right? Well, it's the same thing with the pharmaceutical ads. Mm-hmm. When you listen to the myriad of things that can and possibly will happen to you, nobody would ever opt to take that drug unless there's somebody, typically the doctor or the pharmacist, who's saying, don't worry about that. We know this is safe, otherwise I wouldn't prescribe it for you. And I think that goes back to the fact that you don't really need hard to justify advertising at all in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
Russ, thanks so much for your insights on this, and thanks to all of our panelists here.